this is my first attempt making this charcuterie board slash serving tray. And there were a couple of things I wish I would have done differently. This is not something I'm an expert on, but something I've been learning and getting better at. So if you have any tips, definitely make sure you leave them in the comments. But let's get started. So I start off with a piece of wood that I got from my local lumber yard. So I start off with placing it into this mold that I got from Amazon. I'll link everything that I used in this video in the description. So I start off by making a line where I want to cut this wood in half in order for it to fit inside of the mold. So I use the miter saw to cut 2 halves in order to fit that into my mold. And then just check to make sure they're the appropriate length. So the epoxy that I'm using is called liquid glass. It's a deep pour. Something to note is that you should try to measure in between the 2 pieces of wood to figure out how much epoxy you're going to need. With this project, I ended up using the calculator that's on the website for liquid glass. Some epoxy manufacturers you'll be able to calculate, and this one turned out to be pretty accurate. I ended up needing about 40 ounces of epoxy, and this one was a 2-to-1 ratio. So I'm gonna pour into 2 separate cups. One of the cups is gonna be the base resin, and then the second cup is gonna be the curing agent. And then I'll take those 2 cups and pour them into a separate cup. And then what I'm gonna do is add my mica powder. I'm not sure if I really vibe with this mica powder that much because I did end up mixing pretty well, but it didn't quite give me the color that I was looking for. And one of the reasons that this could be is because I didn't add enough mica powder. So one of the things that I've heard is a trick to this is adding the mica powder, stirring it, and then when you lift the stick, see if there's any transparency on the stick. Unfortunately, I didn't do this, so I am not able to show this within the video. The color that I was originally looking for was kind of like a burgundy, but it ended up being a little bit more purple than I desired. Before putting the piece in the mold, you should definitely make sure you use some sort of like non-stick spray. It's easier to get the piece out of the mold. I'm then gonna pour the epoxy between the 2 boards and then hit it with a torch to get rid of any surface bubbles. Because the viscosity of my resin was pretty thin, I didn't end up getting a lot of swirls like I would have desired. So if you really want that nice swirl pattern, it's important to use a resin with a thicker viscosity. So once my resin was poured, I placed 2 weights on top of it, but then I realized if I did that, the resin would probably stick to the weights. So I ended up placing another mold that I had on top of that piece and just placing the weights on top of the mold. This will create kind of a divot within the piece. However, I already planned on like planing the wood. So there's actually 2 easier ways that I could have done this that I now realize afterwards. One, I could have created a thinner layer of resin, placed the weight on top so that it wouldn't overflow, wait for that resin to harden, and then place another layer of resin on top. That way I wouldn't have needed the extra weight on the second layer. The problem with this, however, is that if you're pouring color, your color pretty much has to match perfectly in order to get the same color on the top and the bottom. The other thing that I didn't know that you could have done, that I thought about afterwards, you could place tape around the weight because the resin is usually not going to stick to the tape, and it'll be easy to kind of peel off afterwards. So after about 2 to 3 days, I used a mallet to hammer the piece out of the mold. So this is what it looks like after it comes out of the mold. There were a few surface bubbles that were on the bottom of it, which is actually fine because we're gonna put it through the planer and that's gonna pretty much eliminate all of those bubbles. And as you can see, there's also a divot where that mold was. So I placed it through the planer. Something I feel like I could have done differently instead of using a planer is using a router to surface the area. One, because this is a spiral router, which basically means when it planes the wood, it's doing a scooping motion, which ends up leaving a lot of divots in the end, unfortunately. Now what I'm gonna do is cut the edges of this piece so that that little strip of resin is no longer there. So I'm gonna cut each side, and then I'm gonna use a sled to cut the edges. Now I'm just gonna use my router to make a rounded edge around the entire charcuterie board. I only did this on the top. I'm not sure why, I just kind of liked the look a little bit better. Now we get to everyone's favorite part, of course, which is sanding. I started this piece off with 80 grit, and then I worked my way up to 800 grit. you definitely want to make sure you spend the most amount of time in your lower grits. So for me, I didn't spend enough time at 120 and kind of worked my way up too fast, which means I had to go back to 120 and sand up again. So you really want to spend a lot of time sanding at those lower grits before you work your way up. So once I got up to around 400, I started wet sanding, which is just putting a spritz of water in between sanding, one to clean the surface, but it also just makes it easier to sand. Once I got to around 600 grit, I used some water to spray again, this time with a little bit more spray. What this is going to do is it's going to raise the grain. What that means is it intentionally causes the wood fibers to stand up so that they can be sanded off. So I wet the wood and then wait for it to dry, and then I sand it with the 800 grit. Something that I wish I would have done before I started sanding is drill these holes in for the handles. It's fine if you do, I just feel like the order of operations would have worked out a little bit better had I done it beforehand. So after I drilled those holes, I did sand one more time, and then I added a layer of finish. This finish is like absolutely amazing. I've used it for a couple of cutting boards. The color just ends up turning out beautifully in the end. So I definitely do recommend using this. It is a little bit pricey, and also a little bit goes a long way. For this, I actually ended up using a little bit too much. So now I'm just taking a little bit of food grade wax, putting that over it, and then using a polishing pad to go over the piece. And this is just going to seal it all together. And then I just screw the handles into the charcuterie board, and it ended up turning out so much better than I thought it would. Finish looks beautiful. The color is actually better than I expected it to be. Something to note though that you probably can't see in this video is that it's a little bit transparent within the piece, so I definitely recommend using an appropriate amount of mica powder. So if you like this video, definitely make sure you like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.